What if the reason our children struggle to think deeply, empathize well, and articulate truth isn't a curriculum problem, but a story problem? Well, today I'm making a case for why the classics still matter and why our children desperately need them. Hello, my name is Janae Daniels. I'm a wife, a mother of 6, and a former middle school teacher turned homeschool mom. I also am an independent researcher and an educational consultant. Welcome to the School to Homeschool podcast. Okay, y'all, I have to admit something. I did not grow up in a family of readers and literature. Like, I didn't. I was just talking to my sister about this, that we never went to the library, mostly because we had 2 overdue books that my mom ended up having to pay for. And so she didn't want to go back because she's like, oh, if we go to the library and then we lose the books, then we have to pay for the books. And just an added expense. And so growing up in our personal family library, we had encyclopedias, we had scriptures, and we had 3 children's books. 3. One was the Brer Rabbit stories. It was missing its spine and most of the pages. The second was an overdue library book that my mom ended up having to pay for once we lost it. And then the library wouldn't return the money refund her once we found the book. And that was called A Giant Jam Sandwich, which I bought. It was one of the first books that I bought when my husband and I got married. I bought for my boys because I loved the story. It was a fabulous story. And then the third book, also an overdue library book that my mom could not get refunded once we found it, was The Magic Porridge Pot, written and illustrated by Paul Caldone. And I also love that book. I don't think it's in print anymore. I had to find it, and I bought it off Thrift Books several years ago because I did love that story as a kid, because it was one of the few stories that we owned when I was a child. And then as a teenager, my mom read to us one time that I can remember, and that was at Christmas, and she read a Christmas story to us, and I was like 14 or 15, and I was completely mesmerized and delighted by the story. But beyond that, she didn't read much to us. Contrast that with my friend Elizabeth, who I met in high school, and every night her dad would get together and they would read classic literature together. And he would, I remember she said, we're reading The Scarlet Pimpernel right now. And she loved it. And it was delightful. She would tell me when we'd get together, she'd tell me the chapters that he had read and that, continue with the story. But I didn't read, other than in school when we were assigned reading, like Animal Farm. I didn't read classic literature. I would read different books, but classic literature is not something that I grew up reading, other than the little bit that we read in English at school. So fast forward to college, and I'm taking an ethics class. The literature classes that I had taken, we read modern classics, but not really. I take that back, because I had a humanities class where we had to read some of the Greek and Roman classical literature, which I'll talk about the difference in a minute. And we had to read some of the Odyssey, and we had to read, we had a variety of things from classical literature that we had to read. But I was taking this ethics class, and we were told to choose an author that we've always wanted to read, but had never read any works of. So I chose C.S. Lewis. And then that was our big project at the end of the semester. We're going to read it, each read our individual things, and then get with a partner, and each partner would share about what we had read and why we chose that figure and that author and how it affected us, what we thought, and all of that good stuff. So I chose C.S. Lewis because I had never read anything from C.S. Lewis. And I chose A Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe because, again, I didn't grow up reading literature other than school. And I did read, but I'd read contemporary books, but that was it. So I remember I was in my early 20s. I don't remember exactly how. I was in my early 20s, and I was working once a week, I would work in another city 45 minutes away and doing costuming stuff. And so I didn't have a car, so I'd have to take the bus. And I remember taking The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with me, and I was reading it on the bus as much as I could without getting car sick. And then I went and did my job. And I remember sitting at the bus station. It was in January. I wanted to get a jump start on C.S. Lewis. And so I was trying to get through the book so I really wanted to, I loved that professor and I wanted to impress him because I thought I just appreciated what he had to think and I respected him, but I wanted to do really good in this class. So I was in the middle of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I sat at the bus stop and I forgot my gloves and I had my coat on and it was cold. And I sat there and I got to the part of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So here I'm reading about how it's wintertime and the White Witch, and I'm sitting there and it's cold outside where I'm reading. And then we get to the part, I'm reading and reading and reading, and I have to wait a half an hour for the bus. So it's a chunk of time. And I get to the part about Aslan going to the stone table. And as I'm reading it, I start to sob. Like I am emotionally changed. I came out of reading that book as a different person. And it had a far greater effect on me reading it than it did, years later seeing the movie. And I bring that up just because last night, that's what we watched. We watched The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a family. And the movie was great, right? But it did not emotionally affect me the way that the book did when I was sitting there reading it in the cold and reading about the death of Aslan. It changed me. And I think that's the first time that really was my first exposure to really the power of classic literature. Now, mind you, I've done Shakespeare and I've been moved by Shakespeare and I've been moved by the Odyssey and the Iliad. And, I've read a lot of, being a theater major, I had to read a lot of the Greek and Roman, a lot of the Greek playwrights. We did have to read some Roman plays. I've had to read medieval plays and passion plays. And anyway, but reading that modern classic affected me. Then when we started homeschooling and I hadn't been reading aloud and I started reading aloud and we started to read the classics, I remember thinking to myself, why has it taken me this long to read these to my kids? And we're not even all the way through them, y'all. Like I have a list a mile long of books that I want to read with my kids. And we're just checking them off one by one. So I want to talk about what classic literature is versus classical literature. And I want to make a case for the classics today. So first I have to say, George R.R. Martin, who is an author, said, "A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies." Mark Twain says, "The man who does not read has no advantage over a man who cannot read." So I've thought about this, but why classic literature versus modern literature? First, let's start with classical literature and classic literature are not the same thing. Classical literature refers specifically of works from Greece and Rome, like Homer or Virgil. That is classical literature, hence the classical philosophy, also Greco-Roman principles and the classical philosophy of homeschooling, versus classic literature, which are literary works widely recognized as being the highest quality writing and having an enduring quality. Classic literature is, granted, classical literature fits into the classic definition, but not all classics are classical. Does that make sense? And so the broader term is for any book that's high quality, enduring significance, and universal themes that stand the test of time. So first, they have to have artistic merit. Second, they have to have enduring popularity. Third, they have to have universal themes. Fourth, they remain relevant across generations, aka they stand the test of time. Things like Pride and Prejudice. I could read that book 5 million times and never get bored of it, y'all. And it was written in the early 19th. And then there are modern classics like To Kill a Mockingbird, right? It doesn't have to be 200 years old to be classified as a classic. Now, I think about this because when Katie was in she was in 6th grade because we started homeschooling her in 7th grade. She graduates this year. When she was in 6th grade, they didn't read any classics. They were reading The Hunger Games. And I had read The Hunger Games. I like The Hunger Games. It's very emotionally moving. Maybe someday it'll prove to be a classic, who knows? And then they had some other books that they were reading. I don't remember. And then I remember talking to one of the teachers in the high school, and they told me the books they were going to read, and they were modern books. They weren't even modern classic books. They were just modern books that had questionable themes, in my opinion, very politically driven themes. But my kids, Josh and Katie, started homeschooling in middle school. My older two boys had read some of those books in high school, and they went to a public high school. But my younger kids, when I started looking at those books, I'm like, I just kind of feel like those are not necessarily themes appropriate or themes that I want to my kids to, and I don't agree with the conclusions that these authors make. Again, they're not reading classic literature. They're reading modern literature. They're not even reading modern classic literature. It's just straight up modern literature. And so I decided when we were homeschooling that we were going to try to read the classics. Now, one of the things that I started noticing is that the classic literature, in the literature that's older, right? You get the 19th century literature or 18th century literature. The language is a little bit harder, right? Shakespeare is 17th century, and that language is really difficult for a lot of kids. When you introduce it young enough, they get through it. Even as adults, we can get through it. But I found that the more that I would read the classic literature, the easier the language has become, and that kids adjust to the language, particularly of 19th century literature, just fine. But it takes some getting used to. But these are some of the benefits of classic literature. Number one, it boosts vocabulary. It increases in critical thinking. It increases empathy. It teaches history, culture, and universal human themes such as love, struggle, justice. Their rich narratives build attention spans. And I love this, that they both mirror our lives, but also provide a window into other worlds and other times. One of the books that we read in the car, and I chose to listen to this one on audio books because I knew I couldn't pronounce most of the words in it, was Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. We were listening to that in the car, and it's a long book. But the more that we read, the longer my kids' attention spans grew. I've shared in past podcasts, like when we started reading aloud together, I was lucky to get through 5 minutes. And we started with contemporary literature. Well, contemporary classics, like modern classics. I think we started with Where the Red Fern Grows. And at first we were lucky to get through 5 minutes, and we had to work up to longer periods of time. And the kids have to get used to the language. So at the beginning, it was a little bit of a struggle. There was some resistance. And so it takes time to get acclimatized to the language and things like that. We started reading Les Miserables. We were listening in the car as we drive, and we had to drive this long drive to Denver once a week. We were taking the classes a few years back. I think it was our second or third year of homeschooling. And it got to the point that even though the language was difficult, Victor Hugo was a 19th century author, we started hearing the rich vocabulary and the story and the descriptions. And whereas at first, again, this was not the first book we had started. We had been doing this for a while by the time we listened to Les Miserables. The vocabulary was so much more luscious and decadent than many of the contemporary books that my kids had read in public school. And the story and the development of the characters was so rich, and the characters were not quite so polarized. They're not quite so Disney black and white. We do see that in fairy tales. We do see very polarizing characters in fairy tales, and the way that fairy tales are written beautifully lends itself to nuance and moral lessons and things like that. But with Les Miserables, I remember we were driving home and I had to pull over because I started to cry and I was sobbing, and my older kids were crying. We were emotionally moved by this story, by the compassion of the priest and I think it was the bishop. I'm trying to remember. It's been a couple of years since I read it, but just the long, beautiful descriptions. And so we started listening to this language. I've shared this story before where when Katie, our first year of homeschooling, she had started to read a lot of historical fiction, and she started reading the Diary of Anne Frank, and she finished it, and her friend from public school said to her, "Oh my gosh, that was so boring." And Katie was dumbfounded because she was emotionally moved by Anne Frank's story, realizing this was a real person, right? She had lived Anne Frank's life during that time. And she and I had a talk, and I said, here your friend is used to eating Pop-Tarts, Katie, and now you've had this rich banquet of food, and Pop-Tarts aren't good enough anymore. you're now seeing what good literature looks like versus this just junk food of crappy literature that some of your friends are reading. I mean, I'm glad that they're reading, right? You got to start somewhere. You got to, sometimes Captain Underpants will get us into moving into better stuff, but if they keep reading Captain Underpants, it's not going to do them any good. It's not mentally nourishing. And she's like, I'm starting to see that. She's like, she's missing out on all of this rich, decadent books. But that's what classical literature gives to us, is it gives us richness and fullness and allows us to have empathy. One of the books that Joshua was expected to read his senior year, for his last year, his junior and senior year, he had a stack of books that he had to read, everything from personal development to classic literature to economics to philosophy. We had all sorts of books chosen for him, and he would read the books and then we would discuss them and debate over them. And it was really, really cool. Well, he was reading To Kill a Mockingbird, which was on his list, and he was listening to it while he was at work. And he was assigned to work in the back doing dishes one night. He worked for a pizza place, and he calls me on his break. And I was like, hey, what's up? You're at work right now. What's going on? And I can hear a sniff. And Josh was very tenderhearted anyway. He's a sensitive kid anyway. And he's like, I'm sorry, Mom. I've been crying for the last 10 minutes. And I'm like, what happened? Is everything okay? And he's like, I just finished To Kill a Mockingbird. I am a different person. Oh my gosh, I am a different person. He goes, I just had to talk to you about this. And so he talks to me a little bit about it. And then he comes home that night and we have the most beautiful conversation about the world and about people and about justice and about mercy and about empathy. Things that English teachers would the kind of conversation that an English teacher in high school would dream of having, but rarely gets to experience because they have so many kids and half the kids don't even read the books. And I say that because I know enough English teachers, y'all. There are some that read and then the rest that read the clip notes. And here it was this modern classic that affected him so profoundly because the theme was universal. It doesn't matter that it happened in I think it was the 1930s that To Kill a Mockingbird, maybe 20s, 30, 40, 1930s, I think is when it takes place. I forget the setting exactly. It's been a little while since I've read it. But it emotionally changed that kid because he number one, he saw himself in the story, and then it moved him. It moved him to want to be a better person. Now, I wanted you to listen to the language of A Christmas Carol. Listen to this. And I feel like a lot of times our contemporary literature, we're getting more and more spice, which is affecting, that's the pornography that's hitting the girls. Whereas boys today get hit with visual pornography. Girls are getting hit with spicy pornography, girls and women. You get 50 Shades of Grey, you get Twilight, which is not pornography, but y'all, I mean, it's not great literature. The language itself is not great. But listen, even though I did like it, don't get me wrong, I liked Twilight when I read it, but I felt like I was eating a Twinkie versus language like this. Again, we have to get adapted to the language, but it's so beautiful and compelling. So listen to this. Oh, okay, it's talking about Scrooge. Okay. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. I mean, listen to that language. Do you hear that alliteration? Secret, self-contained, solitary, oyster. We get this beautiful literary device. It's almost poetic. We get simile and metaphor in one sentence. We get alliteration, simile, and metaphor. I would that more authors today would write as poetically. Again, I had to get adjusted to Dickens, but once I became acclimatized to the way that he wrote, it started becoming luscious. The language became poetic to me. And now I go back and read some of the contemporary literature. I'm like, oh my goodness. Or you read Jane Austen, and then you read some authors today, and like there's no comparison. Now, granted, there are some authors today that are unbelievable, who I believe will become classic authors, that I believe their work will stand the test of time because it still covers universal themes, and the literature, the language is beautiful. And anyway, but here's my charge to you, y'all. I challenge you, if you have not read any classic literature with your kids, to pick a book and start reading. I always love to start with Charlotte's Web. It's a modern classic. You don't get much better openings than where's Papa going with that axe? Like you just, but I challenge you now, if you're new to reading with your kids, if you're new to classic literature, I forewarn you, you're going to have to build up to it. And that's perfectly fine. You're in good company. That's what the rest of us have had to do too. But it'll change you. It'll change your kids. It moves us. As George Martin says, a reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. And what a beautiful gift that we can give our kids. Now, I'm including in the show notes list of classic literature that is great for kids, including some storybooks as well as chapter books that are classics considered by some. And I'll reference where I get those lists from, because I'm still reading the classics myself. I'm still learning myself. Like, I'm learning and growing with my kids. That's one of the beautiful things of homeschooling, y'all, is we as parents get to learn some things that we may have missed when we were kids, and we get to learn them along with our kids, including the beauty of the classics. So with that, my friends, you are doing so much better than you think you are. Go read some classic literature. You got this. We will talk next week.